Hey everyone, today I want to make a video for anyone who maybe got their first synth and they don't know where to start, anybody who's interested in synths but they're not really sure what any of these terms mean, or anybody who's still confused after reading maybe a review or tutorial that might have assumed that you had a certain level of knowledge that it turns out you just don't have. This is especially for anyone who, like me, decided to get a really abstract synth/sampler as their first hardware synth and wants to be able to confidently turn knobs without screwing up the parts that you like about it. So hopefully I can teach you some basics to get there. My first synth I got was an OP1, an original OP1, and I knew it would be fun and abstract and kind of weird, but I wasn't expecting it to be so abstract that I found myself learning a ton at once. The videos made it look very simple and very intuitive, but then when I sat down with it, I found that I wasn't really sure what I was doing. It turns out that basically every synth has very similar controls in very different parts of the synthesizer, and once you get a sense for what to expect with most synths, you can sit down with almost any hardware synth and you should be able to just start tweaking presets and making music and making sounds that you actually like. Throughout this whole video, I'm going to be using these four synths: a Moog Werkstatt, a Arturia Microfreak, a Teenage Engineering OP1 Field, and a Teenage Engineering OPZ. And the reason for this is because this is an analog synth that represents things in a very straightforward and plain manner, because it's like probably their most entry-level device. This is a digital synth, and it's got a lot of kind of conventional controls. And then the OP1 and OPZ are kind of more abstract representations of the same thing. Like the OP1 is always going to have kind of weird, goofy ways of showing different parameters, and the OPZ is going to do everything with LEDs. So you don't need to learn these, but my point is that if I show you a few ways that these are represented, maybe you can find those parameters on your synth. So before we get into the fun stuff, I want to talk about probably the most basic, which is the way that the keys are laid out and the way that the volume is controlled. So let's start off by just talking about the keyboard, because it's pretty straightforward. If we look at the Microfreak, you can tell it's got these white and black keys, and it looks just like a piano keyboard, right? The black keys come down about halfway through down the white keys. It sounds exactly as I might expect as I play the scale or play a chromatic scale. But this isn't the only way you can represent a keyboard. You can also represent it like they do on the OP1 Field, with these black dots representing the black keys, even though they don't extend between the white keys, and then these white keys representing, well, the white keys. Let's find something a little bit more melodic. I also wanted to mention that some synthesizers have these little pads, and often they'll be made of rubber instead of this clicky material, but this is another thing that you might find, like the Circuit Rhythm, or all the Circuit devices have this, the Play Plus has this. There's a lot of devices. 404s have pads kind of like this. They're all a little bit different, but what they have in common is that they're mostly meant to be used kind of like percussively. And I think that they are a little bit more convenient because you can make it play a whole chord with one of these pads, or you can just map a whole scale to this, and it's not going to be as confusing as like mapping a scale or chords to a keyboard. The last type I want to talk about are these little clicky dots, and they've got them on the OPZ. They also have them on the Werkstatt. To me, this communicates that they want me to be able to play notes and hear the sound, but they don't necessarily expect me to perform on this. And that's when external controllers or MIDI controllers are going to come into play. In fact, some synths don't even have keys on them, and they just assume that you have a controller that you're going to use to actually control the synth itself. Another thing that all of these layouts have in common is that they are all just 2 octaves. And I think there's 2 main reasons for this. The first reason is going to be that then you can, you don't have to store a full-size piano keyboard every time you get a new synthesizer, so you can feasibly have, more than one on a desk. But I also think that it communicates how big they think the sweet spot's going to be. And the sweet spot just refers to when you have all the parameters and controls lined up in a way that sounds good. So some synthesizers, you're going to be able to create a sound and it's going to sound good across 4 or 5 octaves. To me, at least, presenting me with 2 octaves suggests that they think that I'll be able to find a 1 to 2 octave sweet spot for most of the sounds that I make. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company. I'm just saying that from a design perspective, that makes the most sense to me. So even though they have fewer keys and there might only be a sweet spot of 1 or 2 octaves, all of these synths, well, at least these 3, are able to change octaves. So on the OP1, It's these arrows that I can use when the synth is up. On the Microfreak, I can use these arrows. On the OPZ, I can use the plus and the minus here. There's one more thing I want to compare and contrast before I move on to showing the actual parameters and what the different knobs can do. The volume is going to be a little bit different for each of these. The volume on the workstat does not exist. There's no volume control anywhere on here. You have to actually modify it. The volume control on the Microfreak is going to be this master volume. But there's also going to be a preset volume, which I can access from another menu. Your synth is going to have probably a master volume of some sort that's going to be a knob, but there might be a lot in between the synth engine and that master volume that can control the volume. And so if you're having issues with like balancing different tracks, or if your synth is way too quiet or too loud, you're going to want to look into gain staging, is usually the term that's used, to describe everything that amplifies the sound that you're making with your synth along the way until you hear it. So like I said, we've got the Microfreak that has that preset volume in the volume. OP1 also has preset volume at the very beginning and then volume at the very end. So I can adjust my preset volume here, and I can use this knob to adjust volume. However, the OP1 also has a volume control for how loud I record the tape. It has a volume control for how loud that tape is played back, and it has this master volume and some drive on it before it reaches this knob. So my point is that there's sometimes way more ways to control the volume of a synth than is immediately like apparent. So let's talk about actually changing the sound of a synth and not just touching keys and changing the volume. So first thing, it's a little bit boring, but I want to talk about the different types of knobs because this actually does make a difference. So synths all have parameters that change their sound, and you usually can control them with knobs or faders that are usually on the device itself, but it's going to work a bit different on different instruments, and they'll be represented a little bit differently depending on the instrument and the company and all of that stuff. When a synth saves a preset, if it can do that, it's saving these parameters and controls that I'm talking about. Note that most digital synths can save presets, and many analog synths can't. So let's go over to the workstat, which is an analog synth, and this is probably the most straightforward in terms of what these knobs represent. Not in terms of these words and stuff like that, which you will learn later on in this video, but because each of these knobs represents the actual current volume of that parameter. And that's not going to be the case for every single synth. So if I'm here, I can change the frequency. And because I can't pull up another preset, these knobs, because they actually control the flow of electricity, are going to represent the values that that synth actually has applied to it. And I want to bring this up because the advantage is that I can always see what this synth is going to do, but the downside is that you cannot save presets if this is something that your synth does, and if this is the only way it has to control the sound. But what about synths that do save presets, like the Microfreak, but still have some of those knobs that have these little that actually, can have these stopping points? What's that about? So each device handles this a bit differently, and you can actually change what the Microfreak does to manage this. But if you could imagine, what could happen is I could have one of these parameters, let's put attack all the way up, and then I'll change preset. Chances are this preset doesn't have the attack all the way up. In fact, I can see that by looking at the volume, it has almost none. And that just means the sound's going to play really fast. More details on that later. But I can't increase the attack because it's already maxed out. So different synths have different ways of handling this. This one right now I have it set to scale it. So just assume that wherever the current value is the midpoint. But if it's maxed out, I'm still going to run into that issue. Others will allow you to do what's called pickup, which is when it won't change the parameter until you get to the original value, which you just saw right there, if you could see that closely. Others will have the parameter value jump to exactly where the knob is at, regardless of where the parameter was at before. But as you might notice, not all knobs have these little marks, and some of them can move just forever in one direction or the other. And those are called endless encoders. So on the MicroFreak, we have a few of them. We've got these that go through the presets and the modulation matrix and stuff. And we have these 4 orange ones that are going to change the synth parameters. And so these are going to work where whenever I turn it one way, it's going to increase the amount of that parameter and increase the value. And if I turn it the other, it's going to decrease it. Even if it's at the maximum or minimum, I can obviously just keep turning it. It just won't change after a certain point. Oh, you actually need to see the screen there. So I can fill out that full one, minimize that. And I can keep turning it and it won't do anything. And it's the same thing with the OPZ's encoders, where it's going to actually show me the brightness if this LED will show me the value. But I can keep turning well after it's at its maximum value. It just won't do anything at that point. Similarly, we have the same sort of things on the OP1. And I would say these are probably the most intuitive ones to use because they just change the value and you don't have to worry about what happens if you've changed presets or anything like that. Let's start off by talking about what I'm just going to call the sound engine. And so this is what makes the sound itself. Before we're able to shape it, add effects, add modulation, anything, there's got to be something that's generating sound. And that could be like an oscillator, like we have over here, VCO. The O stands for oscillator on the workstat. It could also be these like waveforms. It could be a sample. It could be a number of things. But the cool part about this is that usually it's what they make the most obvious. So it's page 1 of every synth on the OP1. It is the top left part of the Werkstatt. It is these bright orange knobs on the MicroFreak, and it is page 1, the first 2 parameters on the OPZ. So these are kind of the parameters that, in my mind, they really want us to play around with because they're going to be different for every synth, and they're just going to be like, you don't need to memorize these because, in my mind, these are the ones to like mess around with and have fun with. So let's just move some of those so you get an idea of how different they can be. So in this case, I can actually just make 2 different types of waves, right? I could change the frequency of them. So I'm not going to go into any more depth about that because in my mind, you should just play around with those parameters and don't sweat it because that is the super fun part. The rest of it's fun too, but it's a little bit more predictable. The first thing I want to talk about is what if we love a sound, but we want it to start a little slower or a little faster, or maybe we want it to last a little bit longer after we let go. Well, this is all going to be controlled by the envelope. And so you're going to find the envelope by looking for a couple different terms or visual representations. One is going to be the term ADSR, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, release. There's also attack, hold, decay envelopes. There's different types of envelopes, but you're going to either see the term attack somewhere, or you're going to see ADSR or AHD or something like that. You might also see a visual representation, and they almost always are going to take the same shape, at least for ADSR envelopes. So if I change the one over here on the MicroFreak, you'll see a similar visual representation. And, oops, didn't mean to do that. So let's start off with probably the easiest to understand, which is sustain. And sustain just controls how loud it is, the sound is while I'm holding that note. Release, and again, I'm just focusing on the ADSR envelopes for now. Release is going to be how long does the sound keep going after I let go of the key. So let me turn off the release for this sound. And when I let go of this key, it's going to stop immediately. There was a little bit of an echo, and that's fine. That's just because there was an effect. If I turn up the release, though, it's going to keep going. Even if I just tap it, it's going to last for a while, and that's because that's what release controls. So if I change sustain here, it's the same thing. If I change the release here, it's the same. Oops. If I change the release here, it's the same thing. Now we still need to cover attack and decay, and that's everything that happens before the sustain. So what you might hear is that just starts immediately. As soon as I press the key, it's pretty loud. But if I increase the attack, that's going to mean that it's going to take a little bit longer to ramp up to its full volume. And then decay is how long it takes to go from that ramp up during the attack to the level that I've set for sustain, which is how long it's going to hold. And so just as an extreme example, I'm going to turn decay completely off. And what we'll hear is we're going to hear the attack come on, and then we're going to hear it cut off. And we can also have it so that the attack is very immediate and the decay goes for a little bit. And this is going to sound kind of piano-like. Not literally piano-like, but you know, the effect is going to be the same as hitting a key on a piano. And if I hold it down, nothing happens. So this is the case for all these envelopes. I can make very similar shapes and it'll do similar things. But different devices are going to handle it a bit differently. So the ADSR envelope on the OPZ is just going to have the brightness of these represent the attack, decay, sustain, and release. On the Werkstatt, we only have the attack and the decay. We do have the ability to turn sustain on and off, which just means that if it's off, nothing happens if I hold down a note. It's just going to play the first part, and that's it. If I have decay on, it'll do a little bit more. But if I have sustain on, it's going to sustain it. But attack and decay are going to work about the same as they did on the other devices I've shown. Decay here, though, is going to refer less about how long it takes to go to the sustain level, because we can't actually control that, and it's actually more about the release. And that's actually the same on the Microfreak, because they've put them together as decay and release here. Okay, so I've got this all set up. I want this sound to sound like this. I got my envelope going. I got the sound dialed in. Let's just say that I'm ready to play. Let's play a chord. Well, that wasn't a chord, right? And the reason for that is because some synths can only play one note at a time, and those are called monophonic synths or monosynths. But some synths can play more than one note at a time, and yet they have a setting to make them monophonic, and I'll explain why you might use that in just a little bit. So often these settings are going to be in like kind of a secondary menu somewhere. So thankfully the Microfreak, it's pretty straightforward. I just hit this button called paraphonic, but you're going to be looking for something that's like play mode or note type or polyphony or monophonic, paraphonic, polyphonic, whatever it might be. That's going to be what they're going to name the control that will let you make things poly. So on the OP1, I actually have to pull up this separate menu, and then I can change the play mode there. OPZ, it's a bit more abstract, and there's no control over play mode on the Werkstatt. It's only ever mono. So now that I've enabled paraphonic mode on my Microfreak, I can hear that chord that I wanted to play, right? But why would I want to set this to mono if, you know, poly is like what you kind of usually expect from like a piano or something, right? Well, what if I want to play a lead where each note kind of goes straight into the next note? If I have polyphony on, it's going to get tricky, because if I have any sort of release, I'm going to hear overlap between the notes unless my timing is somehow perfect. And if I don't want that, the easiest solution is just to make it mono. Very often, synthesizers will also have what's called glide or portamento. It says glide on the Microfreak, it says glide on the Werkstatt, it says portamento on the OP1. So what that does is it makes it so that instead of going straight from one note to the next, it'll add some space in between, and larger values almost always mean more space between the notes, more in between. And it's going to sound very similar on all these instruments. So if I go here, there are two more types of play modes that I want to address. One is going to be legato, which is pretty similar to mono, but the difference is that it's not going to play the first part of the sound when legato is enabled. So let's say that we've got this sound here, and it's got kind of that loud sound at the beginning, and then it gets quieter. What if I want to make it so that I can change notes without that middle part playing. Well, that's what Legato does. Here's what it would sound like in mono mode versus Legato. It gets rid of some of that harshness, and it sounds like you're transitioning between notes without like replucking a string or something like that. The last thing I want to talk about is unison mode, which not all synths can do, but some polyphonic synths will let you turn on unison, which means it's going to basically work like a mono synth, except it's going to play the same note on a bunch of different voices at once. And so the OP1 has this mode. Let's listen to mono again real quick. And let's listen to unison. So it kind of gives it this sort of like, I don't know, weird shifting kind of feeling. You can also turn on unison mode on the Microfreak. And on the Microfreak, I can control it a little bit more precisely. I can control how out of tune the other voices are, which is why it all sounds kind of weird. Here, let's unison spread. That's what that is. On the Microfreak, I can also control how many voices between 2 and 4 are going to participate in unison mode. Okay, 2 more basic types of controls that I want to explain, and these are going to be some of the coolest ones and are probably going to get you really far with whatever synth you're trying to learn and explore and have fun with. So the first thing I want to talk about are filters. So what a filter does is it just removes part of a sound and it leaves the rest of it. It can also emphasize other parts of the sound. So this probably sounds a bit abstract, but I hope once we get started, it'll sound pretty familiar. You're going to be able to find it anywhere that says filter, anywhere that says VCF, anywhere that says HPF, LPF, or BPF. Similarly on the 133, I've got LPF and HPF, and those both represent filters. And then the OP1 also has a couple of really abstract ones. So regardless of what type of filter you have, you're going to probably be dealing with a cutoff. And the most simple is probably on the Werkstatt because the only options are cutoff and resonance. Cutoff is going to let me select which part of the sound to get rid of. So if I hold down this note and I decrease cutoff, it's going to gradually get rid of the higher parts of the sound until there's nothing left. Resonance is going to make it so that the part of the sound right by the cutoff is a little bit louder, actually a lot louder. So let me just crank resonance all the way up, and you'll hear it as I decrease the cutoff. And those are super common. And so the Werkstatt only has what's called a low-pass filter. And it's called that because it's a filter, and it's taking out everything that's higher than a certain point and allowing everything that's lower than a certain point to pass. If we look at the filter on the Microfreak, we've got 3 types. We've got that LPF, low-pass filter. Resonance is going to sound really similar. We also have the high-pass filter, which is going to work the opposite of a low-pass filter, where it's going to take out the lower parts and it's only going to allow the higher parts to stay in. So here's what it sounds with cutoff or with a resonance. And then a band-pass filter is going to be like a high-pass and a low-pass combined, where you only have this little part emphasized. This is pretty similar to how the OPZ's filter works, even though I believe that this might be like a bidirectional filter. But here's just another example. Let me turn up some resonance and then move the cutoff. So it sounds pretty similar. Let's talk about a couple of the abstract representations of this. So on the OP1, we have 2 types of filters, and one of them is going to be called nitro. And this, I'm going to be able to control the low pass and high pass. I can change the resonance. And so that's kind of like a bandpass filter in a way. You can also use punch, which is like their low pass filter. There's more going on here than just cutoff and resonance, but my point is that still most of what you're going to be tweaking as you play with a filter is the cutoff point and the resonance, even if it's totally different than like the Microfreak or the Werkstatt. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is modulation. So what if on the Werkstatt, I liked the sound of moving the filter much more than I liked the filter staying at a certain point? Like what if I like this sound? Well, I've got a couple options. The first would be to maybe kindly ask a friend or a neighbor to come over and move the knob for you every time that you play. The more likely course is you're going to be able to use what's called an LFO, and basically every synth is going to have some form of this, even if it's not technically an LFO. It's going to have some way that you're able to have these parameters and these controls change while you're playing without you having to change them yourself. In this case, I'm going to use the LFO or low frequency oscillator on the Werkstatt. This blinking light actually shows me what the LFO is doing. So I'm going to change it to triangle, and so it's going to be just kind of like this gentle up and down, and I'm going to make it slow. And to really emphasize this, I'm going to make it so that the LFO is controlling the cutoff on the filter, and I'm going to make it control a bit of it by adjusting this amount. And this is going to be different for all the synths. This is just to give you a general idea. So I can increase the rate, I can change the shape. And that's most of what you have for a large majority of LFOs. You're going to have some sort of destination you can set. So which knob is your neighbor turning? You're going to have some sort of speed. So how fast is your neighbor turning the knob? You're going to have shape. So are they going back and forth quick, slowly? Are they finding random values? Then the last one is going to be the amount. So how much they're actually changing. So basically every LFO is going to have these elements. Similar to the Werkstatt, the OPZ represents the LFO with this blinking light. I can change the speed of the blinking light. I can change how much that blinking light is going to affect the parameter I set it to. I can change which parameter is selected. And I can also change whether it's this gradual, another sort of gradual pattern, square, like we've got over here, where it's just going between one value and the next, ramping up. So there are a lot of shapes that this can take. And we can look over at the Microfreak, which actually has this entire corner dedicated to modulation. So not only does it have an LFO, I can assign the LFO to like 7 different destinations, or I can use the envelope as my modulation source. In fact, several of these instruments can. Let's go back to the Werkstatt real quick. So when LFO isn't selected, EG can be selected, and that's going to mean that the envelope is what's going to be modulating that parameter. So let's turn the attack up so we'll be able to hear the volume gradually increase, and as it does that, we should be able to hear the cutoff gradually decrease. Maybe that's too extreme. So you can also use that on like the OP1, and the Microfreak has a whole row dedicated to the envelope as a modulation source. So this is not uncommon by any means. This is another way that you could add some variation to your sound. You could make it so that the filter's constantly changing. You could make it so that the sound engine parameters are changing. Some of them allow you to change the envelope itself, but it's just, this is going to let you use all of the stuff that you've used before in a more creative way. And you don't have to be super intentional about it, but it might help you figure out how to make your sound more interesting to you. Okay, so that was a lot of information, and this was a bit of a different video for me, but I hope that you learned something from it. And I hope that now you feel a bit confident going around and messing around with your hardware or software synthesizers, and like you're going to be able to sit down in front of any of them and start having a good time. So I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.